August 18, 1977. Memphis is sweltering under the weight of 80,000 weeping fans and 300 National Guardsmen, a city pushed to the brink of collapse. But while the cameras focus on the historic grief, a terrifying security breach is unfolding just out of frame. Suddenly, the impossible happens. A stranger shatters the impenetrable defense line and sprints directly toward the king's hearse. As security stands paralyzed in shock, one question screams louder than the sirens. Who is this person, and what are they trying to do to Elvis's body? When the news broke on August 16th, the world didn't just pause, it shattered. Almost instantly, a massive, uncoordinated pilgrimage began, transforming Memphis from a quiet southern city into a chaotic epicenter of global mourning. Within 24 hours, the population swelled to breaking point, with hotels booked solid for miles and thousands of grieving fans forced to sleep on strangers' lawns, in cars, or on the sidewalks. The city was under siege, not by an army, but by a tidal wave of sorrow that no infrastructure could possibly contain, setting the stage for a security nightmare that was rapidly spiraling out of control. To make matters worse, the atmosphere was physically suffocating. Memphis was in the grip of a brutal heat wave, with temperatures soaring past 90 degrees and humidity that clung to the skin like a wet blanket. The air was thick with a sensory overload that pushed people to the brink of madness. The ceaseless wail of sirens, the collective roar of sobbing crowds, and the stifling smell of melting asphalt mixed with exhaust fumes. Fans were fainting in droves, dehydrated and hysterical, turning the streets outside Graceland into a pressure cooker waiting to explode. The tension was palpable. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a biological hazard, and the collective psyche of the crowd was fraying with every rising degree. In the midst of this powder keg, Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, made a controversial decision that terrified local law enforcement. Against the urgent advice of security experts who warned that the situation was too volatile, Vernon insisted on a public viewing, determined to let the fans see his son one last time. Police warned that this gesture of kindness could easily turn into a full-scale riot. Realizing that the crowd wasn't just mourning, they were frantic, desperate, and unpredictable. By opening the gates to the public, the barrier between a respectful funeral and total anarchy was removed, leaving the overwhelmed security teams praying that the dam wouldn't break. The chaos at the mansion gates was unlike anything the security team had ever witnessed, a physical manifestation of hysteria that turned the entryway into a dangerous choke point. In a matter of hours, over 30,000 people were funneled through the foyer, a crushing weight of humanity that threatened to trample the very home Elvis loved. But the danger wasn't just from the crushing crowd outside. It was festering within the inner circle. In a shocking breach of trust, a betrayal occurred right next to the open casket. A cousin with a concealed camera snapped the photo that would soon be plastered across the cover of the National Enquirer. This internal violation proved that the perimeter was compromised from both sides, stripping away the last shred of dignity and privacy the family had desperately tried to maintain. Outside the gates, the situation descended from chaotic to deadly, turning the day into a tragic nightmare soaked in blood. The streets were so packed that the boundary between traffic and pedestrians dissolved completely, leading to a horrific catastrophe. A vehicle unable to navigate the sea of mourners plowed into a group of fans, instantly killing 2 young women. The tragedy sent a shockwave through the crowd, replacing the sounds of weeping with screams of terror. The funeral had barely begun, and already lives had been lost, creating a macabre atmosphere where death seemed to be multiplying in the oppressive Memphis heat. By this point, the security team was psychologically shattered, operating on pure adrenaline and fear. They were hopelessly outnumbered, staring out at a frantic ocean of people that seemed to have no end. Exhausted, dehydrated, and watching their best-laid plans crumble, the guards were paralyzed by the sheer scale of the event. They weren't just managing a crowd, they were holding back a tidal wave, and they knew their line was thinning by the second. Every guard stood on a razor's edge, sensing that the system had already failed and that the violent energy in the air was building toward a specific, terrifying climax they were powerless to predict. Finally, the heavy copper casket was sealed, shutting the king away from the world forever, and the private sanctuary of Graceland was left behind. As the gates swung open, a ghostly procession emerged, a blindingly bright line of 17 white Cadillacs, gleaming under the relentless sun. At the heart of this spectral fleet was the white hearse, a vehicle that instantly became the center of gravity for every eye in Memphis. It was no longer a protected tribute inside a fortress. It was now a moving target, vulnerable and exposed, rolling slowly out of safety and into the volatile, unpredictable ocean of humanity waiting just beyond the threshold. The 3-mile journey to Forest Hill Cemetery was expected to be a solemn passage, but the reality was a deafening roar of unfiltered grief that shook the very ground. The air didn't fill with respectful silence, but with a collective, guttural wail rising from tens of thousands of throats, a sound so physical it seemed to vibrate through the glass of the limousines. The street had transformed into a canyon of sorrow, where the walls were made of weeping, screaming fans pressing in so tightly that the white hearse seemed constantly on the verge of being swallowed whole. This wasn't just a crowd watching a parade, it was a desperate, writhing mass, clawing for one final connection to the man who had defined their lives. As the cavalcade inched forward, the thin blue line of order began to buckle under the pressure. Police motorcycles, engines revving and sirens blaring, struggled violently to carve a path through the crush, fighting for every inch of pavement. It became a terrifying gauntlet where logic had completely abandoned the crowd. People threw themselves toward the moving vehicles, indifferent to the danger of the wheels, desperate just to touch the cold metal that separated them from their idol. The barriers of safety had evaporated, leaving the hearse exposed in a sea of reaching hands, and inside the cars the tension was suffocating. Everyone knew that in this frenzy, the procession was only one misstep away from total disaster. As the white hearse began to decelerate near the heavy iron gates of Forest Hill Cemetery, the tension that had been building for 3 miles finally snapped. The police cordon, already stretched to its absolute limit, suddenly gave way under the psychological and physical pressure. Out of the blur of weeping faces, a single figure emerged. Not a mourner standing in reverence, but a frantic projectile launched from the chaos. It happened so fast that the human eye could barely track it. One moment the perimeter was holding, and the next a stranger had shattered the line of defense, sprinting with terrifying determination across the open pavement toward the slow-moving target. This wasn't a fan reaching out for a souvenir. It was a full-speed assault. The stranger didn't stop to wave or scream. They lunged directly at the gleaming vehicle carrying the king's body. For a heart-stopping split second, time seemed to suspend completely. The Secret Service agents and police officers, exhausted and overwhelmed by the heat and hysteria, momentarily froze in sheer disbelief. Their minds raced through a catalog of nightmares. Was this an assassination attempt on a corpse? Was the stranger carrying a bomb? Were they trying to claw open the doors and steal the body right there in broad daylight? The ambiguity of the threat paralyzed the security detail, leaving the hearse completely exposed to whatever madness was coming. The spell was broken by a violent collision just inches from the hearse's rear window. Authorities tackled the intruder with bone-jarring force, slamming them into the asphalt before they could make contact with the casket. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and primal. A wave of screams and panic rippled back through the thousands of onlookers, many believing something catastrophic had actually happened to the body. In that terrifying flash of violence, the brutal truth was laid bare. Even in death, Elvis Presley was not allowed to be a private man. The barrier between the icon and the obsession had completely dissolved, proving that to the world, he was public property to be consumed until the very end. The funeral service concluded, and the weeping crowds finally dispersed. But the silence that fell over Forest Hill Cemetery was deceptive. While the world believed the king was finally at rest, the threat to his security hadn't ended. It had simply mutated into something far darker and more calculated. The impulsive hysteria of the stranger rushing the hearse was replaced by a cold, predatory intent lurking in the shadows. Just days after the burial, on the night of August 29th, the stillness of the graveyard was broken not by mourning fans, but by a covert police operation. Officers intercepted 3 men creeping toward the mausoleum, but these nocturnal visitors weren't carrying flowers or tributes. They were armed with heavy tools and a terrifying plan. When the details of the arrest came to light, they revealed a plot so macabre it sounded like fiction. These men weren't crazed superfans looking for a memento. They were part of a clumsy but dangerous ring of body snatchers. Their objective was to blast their way into the crypt, drag out the massive 900-pound copper coffin, and spirit it away into the night. The investigation uncovered that they intended to hold the king's corpse hostage, demanding a multi-million-dollar ransom from the grieving family. The sanctity of death had been breached by greed, proving that even 6 feet of earth and stone weren't enough to protect Elvis from the madness that had surrounded him in life. This specific, chilling threat was the breaking point for the Presley family. Vernon Presley realized that a public cemetery, no matter how well guarded, could never truly guarantee his son's safety against such brazen desecration. In a drastic and secretive move to end the nightmare, once and for all, the family ordered the body to be exhumed. Under heavy security, Elvis was transported back to the one place that had always been his sanctuary. He was reburied in the meditation garden behind the high, ironclad walls of Graceland, where he lies today. Not just for the sake of tradition, but as a necessary retreat from a world that refused to let him go. The stranger who lunged at the hearse near the cemetery gates wasn't merely a chaotic anomaly. They were the ultimate terrifying embodiment of the suffocating adoration that defined Elvis Presley's entire existence. That heart-stopping moment proved that the world's love for the king had long ago mutated into a form of aggressive ownership, where even the solemnity of a funeral procession was viewed as fair game for intrusion. It demonstrated with violent clarity that the boundary between the man and the myth had been utterly obliterated, leaving no space for private grief, only a relentless, consuming public spectacle that refused to acknowledge the finality of death. There is a heartbreaking irony woven into the fabric of those final days. Elvis spent the twilight of his life retreating further and further into the shadows, desperately seeking a moment of peace away from the blinding glare of the spotlight. Yet his funeral became the single most chaotic, noisy, and exposed event of his life. A final, deafening performance where the audience refused to let the curtain fall. It wasn't until the dramatic decision to move him back to Graceland, to the quiet solitude of the meditation garden, that he found the stillness he had craved for so long. There, behind the iron gates and shielded by the walls of the home he built, the king is finally safe from the rushing crowds and the grasping hands of strangers. The decision to disturb his rest and move him back to the mansion remains one of the most significant and debated choices made in the aftermath of the tragedy. It was a drastic measure born out of fear and necessity, a desperate bid by a grieving father to protect his son from a world that wanted a piece of him even beyond the grave. But looking back at the security failures and the near misses of that August week, it's hard to imagine he would have ever found peace anywhere else. Do you think the family was right to dig him up and move the body to Graceland? Or should he have been left at the cemetery? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.